I am Professor Jeff Chase. I'm the university's first or inaugural distinguished professor. However, one of my colleagues who's a little bit short on English skills referred to me as exquisite professor, so I've been going by that ever since. A few brief sort of bookkeeping announcements here. In the case or the event of an emergency, which would never happen here in Christchurch, there are assembly points outside towards the parking lots and outside on the courtyard. I've introduced myself, so we've covered that off pretty much. And the format for the evening, this lecture runs anywhere from 45 to 60 minutes, depending on how I waffle. Because much like an intensive care unit or emergency room doctor, when you show up out of the blue, critically ill and needing resuscitation, they're a bit unprepared for exactly who you are, and I'm equally unprepared for this evening. This is part of the joy of me, as part of my introduction. One of the reasons students come to all my classes is that a bit known for, who knows what will come out of my mouth. So we'll see how that runs, and then we'll take question and answer. There is a microphone. This is being videotaped for posterity, so anything stupid I say you can go back and see over and over again on YouTube. All right, so with that, I should point out that my close friend, colleague, and honorary fellow of IPENS, Dr. Jeff Shaw from the Christchurch Department of Intensive Care, is here this evening. And he's here with one of my postgrads who he convinced to move all the way from the back row to the front, you poor bastard. All right. The other bad news is these have gotten so large that we do them here now, and I can't sort of jump up and work with this. So they give me a laser pointer, which is really good and useful, but it doesn't suit my hyperactivity too well. So we'll see. Tonight's topic, what if critically ill patients could be helped more? All right, or maybe subtitled, why getting old, ill, or unlucky costs too much and the role of technology in solving that problem. So a bit of an overview. This talk is really more of a discussion, explore and answer sort of a series of questions. What is the intensive care unit or the ICU? What is its social and economic impact? Why do I care? Demand for that and for healthcare in general is growing pretty hugely, but does doing more for patients, which usually is equated with some sales representative coming in and saying, buy my new $10,000 gadget, actually mean that we're going to get more, and doesn't mean it should cost more. Certainly if we want to improve outcomes, one of the standard theories is we should pay for the more expensive, newer drug, we should buy the newer, more fancy piece of equipment. All of this seems to be the story. I will open this to you with an idea of giving you a bit of a really broad background about this, that when my first son was born by emergency cesarean section, they came in, they told me before this happened that if you want to see a child who is distressed in the womb, you can see a decreased variability in the time between heartbeats, decreased heart rate variability. And don't worry, we have the fetal monitor on, but to see the decreased variability, we've got a special monitor. It's called a Marquette monitor, and it costs between $15,000 and $20,000. It's the same thing the other one does, but $15,000 more. So it's special, and they brought it in, and it came with a special person who knew how to push all the buttons and run it. And they slapped it on my wife's rather large belly. And certain enough, another episode came along, and the heart rate drops, and the variability drops. They said, oh, yep, the variability's there. So I could have told you that without the $15,000 monitor. Oh, no, it's impossible without the $15,000 monitor. Impossible. Completely unmeasurable, a phrase you'll hear tonight. So, well, really? Because, when it was normal around 120, you see 120, 123, 118, 127, 121, 115, 120, 120, 127. It's all over the show. When it would drop, you see 92, 92, 93, 92, 92, 92, 91, and so on. I said, well, I know a little bit of math. I said, it's probably less variable. No, I need the $15,000 monitor and the special person and the cart with the wheels to get it around. So, can technology make things better, or do they just make things more expensive? All right, so this talk isn't for the economically squeamish, you are forewarned, but we exclusively avoided any of these gross medical pictures, or almost all of them anyway. So, why should we be concerned about intensive care, right? There are anywhere from 15 to 19 patients in the 17-bed intensive care unit at Christchurch Hospital at any one time. So right off the bat, you could think, gee, how do you get 19 patients into 17 beds? And it's not the sort of simple answer. Everybody kind of makes room. It's under incredible demand, all right? 1 of 2 of you in this audience will be in intensive care at some point in your life. All right, so everybody grows old, ill, and occasionally unlucky. Is our ability to treat everyone to the best possible medicine available, is it shrinking? Is it necessary? These are certainly the debates that go on. When the mammogram age limit for women for breast cancer screening was dropped from 55 to 45 and changed every other year, if you crank through the numbers and the compliance and what age people get them, what you found out was that the government extended health care to even more people to protect them and decreased by 25% the number of mammograms it had to give out each year. I don't know about you, I'm kind of cynical about costs in government. So it's one of these areas that you want to be careful around the numbers and understand that as ever more people are demanding care, it's becoming increasingly expensive to afford it, which means something has to give. Can the demand for critical care destroy New Zealand's ability to deliver health care? Will all of us go without regular care just because of intensive care? Not entirely possible. All right? Or will it destroy our ability to deliver pensions and other critical services? What will we give up? So here's the way I tell this story. One way is to say 1 in 2 of you will eventually visit an intensive care unit for other reasons than being a visitor. All right, in August 2000, my wife and I arrived in New Zealand. Just before that, the national-led government falls in part, small part, due to healthcare's waiting list reaching 3,000 in a country of 4 million. That meant 1 in every 1,300 people was waiting. The Labour-led government, by August 2007, this isn't a political diatribe against either party, right? They cut the waiting list to just under 10,000 by sending 36,000 people back for reevaluation. So that was good news because now only 15 in every 1,300 are waiting. By August 2013, which was the nearest August I had to hand when I made this slide, right? It's really not worth the study because everybody just jiggers the numbers, right? Nowadays, the phrase is, gee, you know, you appear ill, you might need care. I think it's best that before we put you on a waiting list, you come back in 6 months and we'll see how you're going. All right, so solution, you need to get more productivity from healthcare, all right? Preferably without sacrificing the quality of care, the cost of care, right? I.e., you want to provide better care with less people at lower cost per treatment is what we want from our internet providers, Sky TV, almost everything we buy. But it also is a pretty big ask because medicine is, you know, really complex. So one of the questions might be, why bother? If healthcare becomes more expensive but everything else becomes cheaper, we buy less flat panel TVs and less cell phone time, we spend more on healthcare. This is certainly one major economic argument if you read the economics tests and texts around something called Baumol's cost disease, which just says that anything involving people like education and healthcare will just always increase in cost faster than inflation, while other things decrease in cost less than average inflation, and eventually everything will be education and healthcare and everything else will be almost free. Good news from my salary. Not so good for everybody else. Healthcare grows by about 0.24% of GDP per year. Over the last 20 years, that's about 5% more GDP, or about 7 billion in New Zealand, Australian 70 billion-ish or more. All right, so imagine what a free 5% of GDP would be worth to governments these days. If you go around Europe, what you'll find is this country is bankrupt. It's got a deficit every year of 3 to 4% of GDP. What if you could just show up and go, boom, deficit gone? All right. 20 years ago, that 5% wasn't spent that way. It was spent on other things. It was also spent, because it could be spent on other things, making promises to people about pensions, about social services. Critical care, why we're here for intensive care, is about 10% of healthcare costs, which are in turn currently 10% roughly of GDP in the OECD, unless you're in America where it's 18, because everything's bigger in America. All right, and that leads to about 1%, maybe 0.5% in GDP in New Zealand, 1.8% in the US, and so on. The current growth of costs, this is largely demographic. There's far too many people getting old. They should stop doing that. All right, it's certainly not sustainable. All right, when I started working with Dr. Shaw almost 14 years ago, you'd walk into the ICU. It was really rare that more than 12 beds would be full. Whew, pretty busy. Now it's equally rare that less than 12 beds are full. Expectations are also rising faster. Everybody falls over, has a heart attack, something bad happens. They expect to be fixed. right? And that expectation rises faster as well than our ability to provide that expected care quality. I blame it on doctor TV shows. So there you go. Economics 102, the bread and the butter. All right, critical care has several difficult problems: reducing cost, improving, protocolizing, which is just another fancy way of saying we do the same thing every time, in several core areas, despite the obvious potential improvements in outcome if they could be figured out. So these are mechanical ventilation, helping people to breathe; cardiovascular system, CVS, diagnosis and treatment. So cardiovascular dysfunction, it's the leading cause of admission and mortality in the intensive care unit. Glycemic control, control of blood sugar. All right, again, affects 1/3 to 45% of all patients in the ICU. High blood sugar levels lead to an increased risk of death by up to a factor of 4. All right, great odds if you're playing the lottery. It's just the wrong lottery to be playing. So these are 3 bread and butter therapies. Patients, probably each one, if not more than one, are received by 1/3 or more of all patients. And the problems we see in them are really consistent across these patients. These are great areas to attack, right? Don't worry about a fancy new drug for a particular infection. Attack the things that everybody uses that increase the length of patient stay, the cost, therefore, of that patient stay. Mechanical ventilation, for example, adds 80% to the cost of each day and just about doubles the number of days you spend in the ICU. And by the way, the more of it you receive, the more likely you are to die, which sounds odd for a function that's supposed to help keep you alive. Cardiovascular function is another one, and poor glycemic control. All of them increase the risk of other bad things happening, which then cascade onwards. All right? These therapies affect almost all ICU patients, and again, reducing them means reducing the cost and the mortality of intensive care. So, a business approach. This is sort of the standard approach to healthcare reform, not only in New Zealand, but everywhere else. Take a business approach. Will be more efficient. I spelled it with one F to save myself some time. So, I noticed, as Gilbert's colleague says, submit efficiencies in another department, always the best way, right? Never look in your own, right? You might have to go back to work with those people again. All right, and so I formed a Kaizen team to find solutions. I asked some people in that department to be on the team, but they were busy being inefficient. So hopefully, my ignorance, and I have certain ignorance, be seen as sort of an aggressive objectivity. And this is what happens. You get a business team together full of leading doctors, often from other units, because your unit is under a great deal of stress to provide the care that it has. And they come down, they examine what you do, possibly from a perspective of not really understanding what it is you do, and they think, gosh, you know what? If I was you, but I'm not, I could do that way better. All right? I told my wife this when our second child was being born. Boy, she didn't take it well. All right? So business efficiency solutions, just doing the same thing but better, more efficiently, faster somehow, isn't necessarily effective in medicine. It's often not good medicine, but it is the current approach. All right? One of my former PhD students graduated. He makes a heck of a lot more money than I do working for a consulting firm that is hired by district health boards in Australia to go tell people how to do medicine better. All right, so in the last 30 years, however, technology has drastically reshaped how we do things in almost every industry. But a lot of the technology you find in the hospital, while it glows with cooler colored lights and has screens and other neat stuff on it, that looks really modern, actually the fundamental technology really hasn't changed. So the inevitable why and what to do. All right, why? Productivity improvements driven by technology. These have occurred in many other areas. They haven't reached medicine or education for that matter. So as I said before, I straddle 2 unproductive sectors. You should probably take that in mind for anything that I say that sounds conclusive. The difficulties: improving productivity is easy. Just reduce the care and spread the resources over more patients. That's kind of what we do now. Or we tell you to come back when you're, really unwell. Harden up. All right, this already occurs to an extent, particularly if you look at patient-nurse ratios in the ICUs in the US and EU. All right, so for every patient in the ICU here, there's basically 1 nurse. Give or take that they have certain other duties, it's about 0.8 of a nurse. In the US, it might be 0.25. All right, this is an area where things change fast. You could be doing relatively well one moment and not so well 30 minutes later. I'm sorry, your 0.06 of the nurse that you get, she was away or he was away and not available to see that. And there are lots of alarms around the bedside, but frankly, there are so many, and the regulatory agencies make sure that you make them sound for almost everything, that the very first thing the clinical staff do after they turn on a new piece of equipment in the ICU, typically, is they turn off all the alarms. Because it makes a heck of a lot of noise. It's really distracting. So, there's this inevitable demand, do more with less, right? And it's just not sustainable, right? My oldest son, he's about 10 now, he likes to go do cross-country running. And he's reasonably fit, but not the fastest kid. But he's got this idea that if he just runs out fast and gets in front of everybody, then maybe he'll be able to hang on and stay there. This doesn't work for him. It doesn't work for healthcare, almost any job. You can't just run faster when you need to all the time. So increasing protocolization, this idea of doing everything the same way in simple, efficient, effective steps, it helps, but it typically provides what we call a one-size-fits-all solution. We take one simple measurement of some parameter that we can get easily, and we make a decision on that. And it's the same for everybody who has the same measurement. It doesn't take into account as to whether that measurement is rising or falling necessarily. All right? Checklist, see, do, done. Simple, easy. It may not be the best, but everybody gets the same, and at least we know how things go wrong, and it does help by adding consistency. All right? It certainly doesn't improve care for everyone. If it's better for 55% of the patients compared to the treatment before, which was about 50-50, well, 5% are doing better, but 45% are still not doing as well as they could. So we look at patient-specific care. How can I do this to improve things? But I still want to keep it consistent. But I want one method, one way of approaching the problem, as you'll find out, using technology to make it better for, say, 80 or 90% of the patients. All right? So these are things that we want to attack. We want to do it for things that have not enough resources and time. The how of how we do that, that's pretty much today's topic. So why don't we get on to it? So here's one vision of the future. This could be a patient. It's actually a pig in Belgium in a study we were doing. Pay no attention to the man behind the computer, my Belgian colleague, Dr. Tsev, but instead pay attention to the computer and all the cords running from the computer to the various bits of gear. There are approximately 15 channels of data coming from that patient, as it were, or subject in this case. All right, the lack of technology itself, one of the key things about this, particularly in intensive care, isn't an issue. There's a lot of technology in intensive care. There's ventilators, there's a huge number of sensors. These are catheters that you can wind up and put inside the body and measure pressures and flows inside. There are computers to record and present all this data with gleaming formats at only 10,000 bucks a pop. Rows and rows of infusion pumps to provide nutrition and drugs and fluids. All right, each with its own cool interface and an inability to talk to any other piece of equipment. Each one is individually computerized, but often has no ability to talk to any of the other pieces, and the makers like it that way. So interestingly, especially in the clinical sense, no one really notices all this technology. All right? So you see the picture here, he's resting comfortably. Okay. All right. However, you take an engineer into this situation, right? And they tend to miss the patient. Quite often I have a lot of colleagues overseas, yeah, I don't know what this stuff I'm studying is, but man, look at all this cool gear. All right, so you could go in tomorrow, but it'll take the plumber 3 days to disconnect you. So what's missing, right, is the integration of two things. Both the integration, all the technologies, you want to get data from one more of all these, compute with it, and send it back out to these pumps or the ventilator providing care. And equally, not only linking all that technology, you want to link the patient. What can we know of their physiology? Something these scientists over in the science building study, we don't talk to them too much because they claim they're real scientists and we're just engineers. All right? What can we learn from them and from the doctors about patients and how the human body responds? And how can we integrate that into a computer where we can process it with all this other data? Okay? If I can send an email from myself to my visiting Hungarian colleague sitting just across the table, it's a complex email with several attachments, and it goes all the way to our server across campus, and then all the way out in New Zealand, and then it makes its way to Europe in various pieces, where eventually it ends up on a server in Hungary that he's accessing, which goes, oh, you're in New Zealand. Sends it all the way right back. Right? If we can do that in fractions of a second, all while talking on a cell phone, doing something else, right? Just to send that email, you know, about a meter. Then certainly we could use, a little bit of computation and a bit more knowledge about the patient and bring engineering and medicine a lot closer together and do something really efficient and useful. So the real problem in 3 easy pieces. Piece number 1, a wealth of numerical data doesn't necessarily have direct clinical meaning, right? Often does not provide a clear physiological picture to the doctor. So you saw my original vision of the future. 15 cables coming out of that subject. It's not an unusual number of channels of data. You can see on the slide back here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 channels plus about 5 or 6 numbers up the side. But it doesn't tell the doctor his heart is beating rapidly but still not pumping a large volume of blood, right? Which is what they want to know. They want to know, are you pumping enough blood to perfuse your organs, or are your organs starving for oxygen and therefore slowly dying? It doesn't tell you that, yes, your glucose is high, but also that your ability to utilize insulin to reduce it is low. Therefore, maybe I should just put a little less nutrition inside of you since you're not able to take it up and use it anyway at this moment. It certainly doesn't tell you what happens the next moment. You get broad distance surrogates of all this. All right, the numbers change moment to moment. Nobody sits there and stares at them, you know, watching them carefully. Certainly in my first example, the neonatal nurse, the neonatal doctor at the scene didn't know enough to look at the numbers and certainly didn't stare at them as long as I did to say, gosh, you're right, I don't need the $15,000 monitor. Instead, they brought in the expensive piece of gear to do that one very simple computation. Clinical staff, it's not really their fault. They're not trained to think about numbers like engineers who design the equipment, right? And pretty much said, wow, this is a great interface. How do you know it's a great interface? Well, we asked the 3 doctors that work with the company who are on our advisory board, and they really liked it. Of course, they're on the advisory board because they really like technology. And, you know, we looked at it a lot and we thought it was great, right? So this is kind of like, you know, asking a man to go out and buy their partner or wife some women's clothing. It just never works out. So all this creates an aura of confusion and uncertainty. All right, this is known by the psychologists to suppress critical thinking. And by the way, you know, it's intensive care. So I've already spent, gosh, 16 minutes telling you that story. You know, I've looked at all these numbers. I need the answer, you know, now. All right. So simplification, how can we turn all this set of numbers into a clear physiological picture? You let the caregivers rule the technology instead of the technology ruling them. All right, certainly I am ruled by technology. My email box bleeps, like, huh, something's got to happen. All right. Right now it's the other way around. Every improvement in technology probably imposes a lot more demands on clinical time than the benefit to the patient. This is profitable for companies, but not for doctors. The real problem, parts 2 and 3. So it's not just the technology or how it's designed. ICU patients are difficult. If we could get a better class of ICU patient, life would be a lot easier. They're difficult to manage because they are highly variable. They change moment to moment. They're often in intensive care because they had what you might call a highly variable moment. I was walking down the road, I was perfectly fine. Oh, my chest. That's a highly variable moment. It will get you to intensive care relatively rapidly if you're nearby to an ambulance in a hospital. Yielding number 3. The greater the variability arising from either the patient or the interpretation of the data or even just the ability to see all the data, all right, then the more difficult it is to manage that patient. All right? The more things can go wrong without you quite knowing, the more variable the care, and all those together mean the more likely you have a lesser outcome, which is our very polite way of saying dead. All right? So this is bad stuff regarding cost as well as death and disability. So what about protocolized care? It's a big buzzword if you look up protocolized care. The goal is to reduce what's called iatrogenic component, or the iatrogenic component due to variability in care. Right? Iatrogenic is a fancy Latin-derived word used in medicine to say mistakes we made or stuff we can't control, but we actually end up doing. So it is the things due to the variability of the caregiver. We say, well, we'll take the variability of the caregiver out of it, or, you know, their interpretation, which might be excellent or might be less than excellent. We're all good at some things and not at others. And instead, what we're going to do is we're going to make everything subject to, you know, something defined as good. Brings everything to the middle. It's a one-size-fits-all approach. It is applicable to groups with well-known clinical pathways, but we just talked about ICU patients are highly variable. You're there from a highly variable event. So automatically, you're not on the well-known clinical pathway necessarily. So it reduces variability in how the care is given, but not all patients are the same. Who knew? So it can't take into account things like inter, between patients, and intra, how much I change over time, patient variability, and particularly the variability in response to care. If everybody receives largely the same care, and everybody has a different response to it, then everybody's going to actually get different care, even though I made it all the same in how I tried to give it. So what you want is a patient-specific, we call it one method-fits-all approach, that preferably one that doesn't add effort, time, or cost to care. So we talked about variability. There are two kinds. There's the variability in outcome due to the variability in care that you're given. And on the other axis, there's a variability in outcome or response due to your own variation, intra-patient variability, or the inter-patient variability between care, right, in response to therapy. And what you'd like to do is that protocolized care can reduce this component. What we want to do is get rid of this component. And remember, less variable equals less costly equals better outcome. All right? And we believe that model-based methods, this is where some of the engineering starts to creep in, can provide patient-specific care, robust to these variabilities, all right? And therefore, we can do things that protocolized care cannot. And that's really what we're on about tonight. So that's a summary of the problem, or the end of the beginning. Our goals, we want to break the cycle of low productivity growth, increase productivity significantly without simply saying, work harder. All right? We're going to require doing patient care actually a lot differently in some ways. But in the absence of the cures-all drug, the same technology tools are at hand, so we need to find some way to use them better. We often say something along the lines of, we don't need better medicine, we want to be able to do medicine better. So this is actually a huge ask. It requires something a little bit more revolutionary and disruptive than evolutionary. Yet in medicine, evolution is the preferred route of change. And you want to like that, really. All right? You know, hey, I got something that cures everything. Oops, sorry, wrong. A lot of dead people. Right? Evolution, the steady gradual buildup of evidence. This is good stuff. So the question really is, how do you evolve in a revolutionary fashion? And maybe we'll get around to that. So this turns out maybe a bit complex. This is just my way of breaking up the sections. But you got two people with advanced engineering degrees, unclear on the concept. This is an engineering joke. So you know, he's sitting there, he's saying, okay, we should be able to figure this out, right? It's an engineering joke. Anybody know why? None? Nobody with an engineering degree would ever read the instructions. Engineering-based solutions. When in doubt, apply manly force. This is the first rule of mechanical engineering. I've blamed it on a colleague because otherwise people would quote me. It turns out that a man whose English wasn't quite so good as mine said this a long time ago. It's called Shattuck's Logic by Jacques Roussel and René Bohr. And it says to heal something that doesn't work or that makes too much noise, it is necessary enough to hit on it with something that works better or that is noisier. I think mine's simpler. Anyway, we also maybe want to say, apply finesse to create patient-specific solutions, better known as agent craft, beat youth and speed every time. This is unknown a long, long time ago. It appears all over the place. So what is engineering? Maybe the first question, right? Certainly we've already learned we don't read instructions. All right, and why is it relevant here? Preferably before the big bomb goes off. So what can an engineer do about it or any problem, right? Engineering analysis is used in any number of places. We take it for granted. We did a bunch of engineering analysis on Sarah Ulmer, and she went from finishing second at everything to winning everything. All right, that's entirely the fault of the mechanical engineering department at Canterbury. I want to say that now. All right. Rocket and space and satellites that beam down television, thermodynamics for heat pumps, cars, jet engines, all sorts of good stuff. Fun and element analyses to build buildings possibly a little better than we have in the past. Cars, car accidents, crush. I've worked in that industry, that industry, that industry. Not so much that I didn't like that course as an undergraduate. And that industry. So we can take these systems and we can model them to death. Give me a computer, I can model anything. So each one is described by a series of equations that we use to make these models, and they're all nice and complex and mathematical. I won't spend too much time on them. Makes people weak and dizzy. including my students. So these systems are equations of motion. We can analyze them on the computer. We can create these models. And we use those models, hopefully properly, to design, optimize, create a better design. And we can do this now faster and faster and faster than ever before. When I started my career at General Motors a long time ago, it took about 400 or 500 engineers on a platform to take a new car from concept all the way to production. All right? Now, that number, it wasn't just a General Motors problem for reasons I won't get into. It's a different lecture, maybe. That number today is about 140. All right, we can all do a heck of a lot more with these. In that time, a long, long time ago, my university, right as I graduated, was getting its first cluster of these weird things called personal computers. You may have heard of them. All right, so we can use them to be more efficient, stronger, faster, better at what we do. So what we're going to do here in what we call model-based therapeutics is really similar. We're just going to slide that and translate right along. We're going to engineer people, preferably solutions for very ill people. And we're going to use the same kinds of equations to model the physiology. And we're going to capture those equations. We're going to simulate that. We're going to be able to show, or we have shown, that these actually match what real people do, these in silico virtual patients. We're going to design and optimize therapy, put it at the bedside, and win. All right, however, the problem is that current clinical practice often looks something like this. You've got protocolized care. You've got a large flow chart, and says, I know that, Og, but what does it say? Og assures me that this will improve efficiency and keep us ahead of the Cro-Magnons down in the valley. And the other guy says, no, but it just seemed easier when we just went hunting. All right, and it's labeled why Neanderthal man became, I underline the extinct part. All right, so what you get is one size fits all. And you see the currency, the clothing department complaints here. When we said one size fits all, we didn't mean all at the same time. All right, so how do we do this? How can we add organization? How can we make the method fit everyone, one at a time, each patient individually, rather than trying to stuff them all into one sweater at once or the same size sweater? How can we make that happen with engineering in a way that doesn't add time, cost, effort, agony, make it want to work? So we call it model-based therapeutics. First, we describe the physical systems to analyze. We've got the metabolic system up here, some cool pictures of a pancreas that secretes insulin, and the liver that's your main metabolic organ, and you've got receptors to take glucose up into cells, and you've got glucose production, insulin production, all sorts of good stuff. And all the way down at the bottom, finally, we've stored it in the cells at multiple scales. We can build the mathematical model of that. It looks like a bunch of different colored circles because different colors mean you're smart. All right, so you've got your insulin. It goes into IV. Your pancreas secretes some. You lose some to the liver and kidneys. All right, you've got your glucose in red because that's bad stuff if you got too much. It goes to the brain takes it up. We've got income coming from whatever you're being fed, from the gut in a different model. It gets taken up into the cells, the liver, which can also produce glucose. Across the line of insulin sensitivity, what's that whole body gearing? All it really says is, excuse me, how sensitive is my body? How useful can my body make use of this insulin that I'm giving? And we can do that in, well, it's actually about 5 more equations that go after that, but we can do that in 3 to 7 equations in, 37 terms. And we can stick it into a computer, and eventually we can optimize care on a virtual patient, but eventually get that out and actually apply those same models at the bedside. So what does the bedside really look like? You've got a simulated patient here. You can measure things like glucose, cardiac output, blood pressures, pulse oximetry, heart rate, ECG, lots and lots of stuff. This normally goes into a box. It's red, it's square with 2 lines. And it's called the doctor's clinical experience, education, and intuition. And what they do with that is they create a mental model. Well, what is the patient's response to insulin? Do they have sepsis? Is there circulation, resistance problem? Do I need to change the fluid therapy or give more drugs to make the heart beat better? And they think about, well, if I knew some of this or I had to guess at it, I might optimize glucose control, I might manage my ventilation, I could diagnose or treat cardiovascular dysfunction, many other things. And that all happens inside their heads. All right? And then finally they make a decision and they go to one of those pits of gear around the bedside and they say, well, we'll change the insulin or the glucose or the sedation or the steroids and vasopressors, some other drug. All right? Or we'll add more pressure to the positive ventilation to help people breathe. And they'll go away and come back, and maybe later they'll look at some of this to more see to how everybody responded. All we want to do is replace that with physiological models and algorithms and make a lot more of this definite and known, quantified, based on better use of the numbers. So really, we're not going to change anything in how anybody works, right? We want to fit into right how the practice works. We just want to do it in a way that can be a little bit smarter, that can use math to see things inside the data that a doctor cannot. And many people, I should note, they confuse bioengineering with something that's sort of complex, incomprehensible, usually from an island there Dr. Moreau lives with his strange animal people. And you take the doctor's clinical experience and intuition, we just want to change it for that. Built off that and how they practice, but also a wide range and huge body of other science that can't all necessarily be just called up, poof, at that magic moment. So what we're trying to do is be smarter about what we do with the data, the literature, all the knowledge that's out there. The real goal, individualized care. The models and data let us see things we normally cannot. And from them, we can know a lot more than someone just looking at the data. I go back to my first example. The doctor says, I need the $15,000 to $20,000 monitor. All right? I happen to know a lot about mathematics because I was in school for next to forever. All right? And I can look at it and say, well, odds are really good. It wasn't all that variable. All right? Now I need the special monitor, right? So how can you bring that kind of insight about numbers and trajectories, match it with physiological insight and science, and medical knowledge and science, and put that together to do something more useful because it's got the knowledge of 2 or 3 or 4 different kinds of people, hopefully encapsulated in an optimal way, all right, to provide that care on the moment so that you don't sit there having an argument with your doctor, but I know numbers, really, you don't need the monitor. All right? One method fits all, not a simple one size fits all. So it's actually a big task to kind of bring all this together. If my student shouldn't up here had known that, he probably wouldn't have started, but now you know. All right, so one size fits all except for you, of course. This is the way it is now. Doctor, I want to choose how I'm treated. You're not just ill, you're deluded. All right? This is great. I love the internet. You can find anything you want. So I went looking for a cartoon about customized or patient-specific medicine or healthcare, and I tried any number of words, and I couldn't even find one to even come remotely close to describing, even sarcastically, anything like what we do. And I spent 40 minutes on that. Okay? So, I get paid something. I don't know what that worked out to be. Probably about $60 of my time. And since that really just basically comes from taxpayer money, thank you. So what do we do with these models in Christchurch and beyond? So we work in the metabolic system. We do work with the pulmonary system and lungs, mechanical ventilation, the cardiovascular system. All right, what is a clear physiological picture? We can measure from the data things like lung elastance, its stiffness, its response to pressure. Is added positive end expiratory pressure stretching the lung and damaging it, or recruiting more volume, which is good? All right, if I add more, will I recruit more volume, or will I just stretch the lung? How to know? I can get an x-ray and see it. When grandma or grandpa comes home from the ICU, small child goes, why is grandma glowing? All right, how have these things changed over time? You'd have to come and do that test all the time. Nobody has that kind of time around the patient, but a computer sits there patiently doing stuff like downloading pictures of dancing cats. No problem. What do we get? Patient status. Patient status over time, we call that monitoring. Are they getting better is the key question. Response to therapy. I made a small change or a large change. Was it good? All in a breath-to-breath, real-time, clear physiological picture that can't be gotten from that data right now. So it's not your father's 1 over compliance elastance, right? It's a dynamic measure of the system elastance. It captures things like chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. One day we'd like to take this out of the hospital to treat people in the community with that. If you wonder what that is, besides a long word with a large series of longer words that go with it in the acronym, it is approximately 0.8% of GDP and annual cost to this nation. It's a dynamic measure. It's patient-specific. Everybody breathes a little bit different. Everybody's response to therapy is a little bit different. I'm capturing it from your breath, from that data, right here, right now. So, at high resolution, we can clearly see these changes over time, the condition, the variability, right? None of these can be measured now with the same resolution. They can only be sort of estimated from the data, and normally someone has to stop and pay attention and use some stuff to do it. It's a direct measurement of something you can titrate to, so the model makes it visible, and then you can titrate care, because what you really want to know with this elastance, all it really is how much volume do I recruit, good stuff, for an increment of pressure inside the lung, which can damage it even though it's unwell and needs that help and support, or bad stuff. And you want that number to be low as possible, right? If it's, dollars per kilogram instead of pressure over volume, and you're going out to buy a nice steak, you'd like it as low as possible. I'd like lots of kilograms, good stuff, for very few dollars, please. All right, so measuring the unmeasurable. All right, in the metabolic system, we can do the same thing. We can capture this real-time insulin sensitivity, or SI, over time in response to glucose and insulin. And what do we get? Patient status, response to therapy. The slides are almost identical for that reason. We can gather all these things. All right, in the cardiovascular, we can do something similar. All right, and what does it really mean? You have a critically ill patient. Here's an example of a picture managed by doctors. There's a lot of empirical thinking that goes into it. You can see a huge arrays of gear. It comes and it goes. You'd like to turn that into something a little cleaner and more consistent. Right? Preferably without making it so incomprehensible that no one actually knows how to use it without a lot of training. Unmeasurables, many clinical decisions are partly blind. They can only measure surrogates of the disease state, such as high blood glucose, but they can't tell you what the glucose response to insulin is without an expensive, very detailed test. So rely on their mental models, their intuition, their experience. Right? The outcome is a variability. Models offer that clear physiological picture. All right? All of which we want because it's a clear physiological picture of a specific patient at a specific point in time. All right? So that's our key goal here. That's really what we do, right? And it also asks the question, what if we could measure things that weren't measurable, so to speak? All right? And again, chosen well, these are the things that you titrate care on, not the surrogate. Glucose is high, add more insulin. You run the risk that the patient gets too low blood sugar and suffers brain damage or death. All right, too high blood sugar increases your risk of death by a factor of 4. Too low a level of blood sugar increases your risk of death by about a factor of 3. All right? So, decisions are made about these, often without knowing them, hence they're the, quote, unmeasurable. If we can estimate or measure them, then we can be more useful. And that's really what we're all about, and that's the real end of the beginning. I want to point out I've gone 43 slides. I haven't actually said what I do. So, some short case examples. I'm going to talk about ventilation and glycemic control. What do we do with ventilation? We push air into the lung every breath to help provide oxygen and support the patient's work of breathing, right? They're struggling to breathe on their own. They're suffering respiratory failure. Help keep the lungs open so they can heal on their own time in the simplest sense, as well as support their ability to breathe. Easy, right? You thought it might be rocket science, but actually they're letting you get better with a little bit of support on your own. So a wish list maybe clinically. If I add PEEP, will I stretch the lung more or recruit more lung units? What extra volume can I recruit with a change in that positive pressure? Did my recruitment maneuver work? And how well exactly? All right. Is patient condition changing? Does the PEEP need to be changed? These are all things about any number of things we do in life. Would be simple. All right? Should I do more of something? If I do more, will it be good? I did it. Did it work? What's my outcome? Did my status in life or whatever I was seeking to change, did it change? All right? Do I need to change my current situation or what I'm doing currently? If you're cooking dinner, you can make measurements and just do all this. You don't even think about it. So these answers are obvious, maybe. All right, but patient-specific variability over time makes that really difficult. It's hard to evaluate in a mental model. Every clinician has a slightly different one. And that uncertainty often leads to less decisions or lesser changes, often when you're trying to treat a highly dynamic and variable patient who wants greater changes. So we talk about this variable PEEP with average respiratory system elastance, which is on this x-axis. So we've got some data and things to show you here on slide 45. All right, and we have, well, the minimum levels here. We might titrate to just a little bit before that, around this inflection. And what it might say, for example, for this patient, all right, the minimal elastance observed at PEEP of 15 centimeters. This patient was, I believe, originally having a best PEEP maybe somewhere around here, was originally ventilated a little bit lower than that. Here's 4 different patients. All right, the minimum PEEP was at 15, the inflection was 6 to 9. And you can see different patients all have different response. We capture things like difficulty in respiratory elastance with COPD, all right, and we don't get nearly as low a level. All right. We can do this over the course of a breath. And we can see that sometimes when the elastance is pretty low, it actually starts to rise. Maybe we're stretching the lung and doing something a little negative there. All right? Maybe here where it rises and then falls, we might want to change the rate or the shape of the flow pattern. Just push it into the lung. Something that's not been seen before. And we can do this every breath. Here are those same 4 patients. And suddenly they look much the same, but still a lot different. And you find, well, that's pretty optimally flat. I picked that one instead of this one. This one, maybe instead of that one. And on down the line. We can capture other things with this. Did my elastance change over time? I did a recruitment maneuver. I saw a 16% decrease, absolute, in elastance. Good news. All right? Before and after, where this was the pressure steps taken, and before and after. Here, I did another big recruitment maneuver in pressure. And at the end of it, actually, it was little change, if anything. The elastance is a little bit higher. So the doctor did this whole maneuver, it really had no effect, something that they wouldn't know. You can say that's over short periods of time, but this is over 6 hours. And what you see is the elastance starting at what's a pretty low and good value from the patients we've observed, and just gradually creeping up by about 40% over 6 hours. If you could see this, you could say somewhere around here, maybe I'll do something. Similarly, I can do this with looking at the volume that's recruited, and I can look at the pressure, and I can look at that the volume I'm getting is increasing over time. Good. Or staying the same over time. Okay. Or it's declining by almost half over 13 hours. I'm losing almost half the effect of my therapy over 13 hours, not visible from the data shown to the doctors, and you have to be watching all the time. So our goal, we want to take clinicians from this, using a computer, the cool interface that's being tested at Christchurch right now, to that. A clear physiological picture to guide therapy, adding more and better information that is not normally available. Guide your PEEP and your mechanical ventilation MV based on these fancy letters, which just are ways of calling elastance. And get a better clinical outcome. Shorter length of mechanical ventilation, less desaturation events for patients, right, in testing now. Glycemic control. This system was used for 6 years, designed off our model starting in late 2005, replaced about 3.5 years ago with something cooler on a tablet that's even more powerful and flexible. We're using that model, simple glucometer, and some pumps to put in insulin and nutrition. My wish list is basically the same as before, but for the metabolic system. What will happen if I add more insulin or less? What is my risk of hypoglycemia, the negative things, for this insulin dose? If I do something, what's my risk? How good is my control? Should I do more? Should I do less? Should I change the nutrition? Or what happens if someone else changed it without telling me? All right? How should I then change my insulin dose? All right? A little side, almost all glycemic control protocols, there have been hundreds published in the scientific literature, are what we call carbohydrate blind. All right? This is like telling someone, you know, you want to lose weight. So what you should do is you should exercise a little bit more, but it doesn't matter how much you eat. And in fact, I'm going to record your outcome regardless of whether you eat fish and chips 5 times a day for every meal or whether you actually, you know, diet and change some of your eating habits to something healthier. All right? You wouldn't expect that out in the real world, yet it happens in certain intensive care units, not here. Is patient condition changing? What happens if it changes between measurements that are quite infrequent? So we stick a nurse in the loop, we get some data, we stick it into the model, some mathemagic happens. We find our immeasurable parameter, insulin sensitivity, and we go out and we look at changing the insulin infusion or the nutrition or both, and we manage the patient. So it's all the same stuff that's already used, just used better. We've talked about variability. You have fixed dosing systems, one size fits all. So you have the patient's response, that insulin sensitivity, which we can capture for any data we have, and it's highly variable. A fixed protocol treats everyone like their insulin sensitivity was basically the same, some flat line, and as a result, the glucose on the outcome is highly variable. With our sort of engineering approach, we take the same variability, we identify it over 1 to 2 hours at a time over the regions we're going to do, and as a result, we can flatten out that glycemic level. Decreasing that level decreases risk of death by up to 4 times. Decreasing the variability decreases risk of death by up to 5 times. Not independently, unfortunately. All right, so they offer you the opportunity to identify, diagnose, and manage variability directly to a guaranteed risk level. How do we do that? Well, we know a lot about a lot of patients, and we know that if your insulin sensitivity is here now in 3 hours, it's somewhere in this distribution across this range. So we get an outcome distribution of possible insulin sensitivity, the peak of which is that it stays the same. And for a given dose of insulin, I get a range of possible outcomes. It's the only protocol in the world that does this. What is the main singular complaint why hospitals don't use glycemic control in any form? If I give insulin, the patient could go hypoglycemic. You could have one of these low glucose levels. Well, if I know where that's going to be, I know that 5%, 3%, 1%, pick your number, will be below this value and not much. And I can adjust my dose to place that number anywhere I want. Then I have exact control to a specified risk. Same numbers went in, same blood glucose measurements. The doctor or the nurse don't have to do anything more. It takes about 2 seconds on a tablet computer to compute. And as a result, I can take that, I can move it around. In our case, we place the 5th percentile here on 4.4 millimoles per liter, which is a perfectly fine level. All right, so why do we do this? We can guarantee risk of hypo and hyper, high blood glucose. All right? We know the range of what is 90% likely to happen. It turns out it's more like 92%. We're a little bit conservative. We know this, and we can dose it appropriately. No other system does that. They just say, if glucose high, give more insulin. If glucose low, maybe stop. All right? Allows the clinicians to set a target band. They can set everything they want. We tend to fix a 5% risk of blood glucose less than 4.4, which translates to less than 1 in 10,000 interventions of a severe hypoglycemic event. One of these ones has real risk. All right? That is less than 2% by patient. Most tight glycemic control protocols reported in the literature are tried. Whether they saved lives or not, they gave up. Why? Because by patient, the number of patients who experience severe hypoglycemia, anywhere from 10 to 25%. Unacceptable. All right? By the way, this is how airplanes are designed and how Christchurch's high-rises should be designed. So we've done this with the System Star and the paper-based Sprint, both here and in Hungary and also in Dunedin. And what you see is that we get extremely high percentages of blood glucose in our target range, all right, by about 20% absolute. Most people don't do better than about 50 or 60%. Blood glucose less than 4. This one's a little bit higher than it should be. This one is only there because one patient started hypo, and it took a while to get up. All right, these are the best numbers in the world. We have a guaranteed risk of less than 3%, 2.5% for this value. It's actually a little bit less. So because we know the risk, we get tight control safely. We do it by identifying this unmeasurable thing every hour with no extra time, effort, or use, just a computer. We minimize interventions, measurements, and the clinical effort with confidence because we have exact knowledge of the risk. If I tell a doctor here or in the NICU where they use a similar system, they do something well, they know the risk. Even if it sounds absurd, they know the risk. All right? And it's low by design. We know what to do when nutrition changes and everything else. So a lot of people say, well, what is the target? Why do you pick that? This hasn't been answered for the mechanical ventilation case. We think we have because of our experience here. We have something called CTIB, or cumulative time in band. It is, in the parlance of my research group, a measure of badness over time. Or exposure, you can take your choice. So you can look at a band like 4 to 7 millimoles per liter, which is what we prefer. And you can say, well, there's a certain percentage of this glucose in that band. You can look at 5 to 8, same predictions, or 4 to 8, a wider band. Right? And what we want to look at is that at any given point, you can have, in this band is 4 to 7, you can have 29% of measurements by this point. Here it's up to 76%. Here it's actually 80%. And by the end, 84% of our measurements were in that band. And the narrower that band, the less variability I allow. The wider that band, the more I allow. The lower it is, the lower I expect that median or mean to be. Virtually every other study says, well, I just want to hit a target. Pick me a target and I want to get there and kind of somehow stay there. What you should see from seeing this is from a real patient, it's pretty typical, is that nobody ever stays in one place for long, ever. If they are, they're probably dead. Bad sign. So we looked at this. We looked at our preferred band. We looked at other people's wider sort of preferred bands. Most people prefer higher ones. And what you have here is the survival odds ratio. So you want this to be higher, right? A number like 2 means you're 2 times more likely to survive. And we looked at how long you're in that band for each patient, whether it's 50, 60, 70, 80% of the time. This is from 1,700 patients on Sprint, from before Sprint, from a trial in Belgium and 7 EU countries. Is there a difference even? And what you see is that if you get a reasonable number, and you saw 80% within a similar band, so if we just got 70% in that band, the bands we prefer, and this is days here, up to day 14, you see that from day 1 it's about 1. Well, you sort of live or die on the first day on the merits of what happened to you. By day 2 is a little bit of improvement, day 3, but by day 5 or 6, I'm up to a number like 2.5, almost 3, all right? Everybody's in the intensive care unit with like a 3-time better chance of surviving. It's a good thing. A very slight change, same width, but just slightly higher, 1 millimole per liter higher, and that factor of improvement is cut in half. Okay, and this matches other people that have looked backwards at data and said, how likely are you to die? A wider band, even worse. But what's really nice about this is this gives you something you can measure on every patient in real time, right up to that point. How am I doing? All right. Oddly enough, for an engineer's perspective anyway, nobody else in the world uses any kind of metric like that, even though we know exposure to high blood glucose has damaging cellular effects, which cause on to damaging effects on organs and on down the line to death. Yet no one wants to measure it in real time or up to a point. They say, well, I wait till the patient's done, then we look at the stats. Clinical use and outcome, we started with some paper-based things built from our models. We went to a tablet, and from that evolved to a new system. It's called STAR, so we've got not only acronyms, but cute figures. All right, in the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit for, say, 800, 1,000 gram preterm infants who have hyperglycemia, it's called Griffin. And as we take it out to the wards with subcutaneous insulin injections, and for people with insulin-dependent type 2 diabetes, it actually happens to be called Dragons. So as a brief pause for reflection, but I'm running short. Engineering plus medicine is equal to patient-specific care. So my main outcome, the main goal of models in engineering might readily be summarized, turning a wealth of data into a coordinated, predictive, and most importantly, patient-specific picture of the clinical situation. You want to make key patient-specific parameters visible to enhance that treatment. The technology is there. What's missing is the finesse. All right, model-based therapeutics, we believe, provides that finesse and provides it in one method. The method is that model and how we use it. Right? What it says about you is it identifies your condition now and then uses an algorithm worked out with the doctors to decide how to treat you, right, is the method. Okay? But it's that method, those models. All right? We didn't say this, but we implemented them with cheap tablet computers. So if you add that up over 1,000 patients, you might add 50 cents per patient. Glycemic control, as we've done it, by the way, we did a study on this. It costs about $10 total per patient treated, adding in everything, and it saves between $1,000 and $2,000 per patient treated. So it saves about 30 lives, 40 lives a year in Christchurch ICU and about $1 million in costs, all of which gets spent providing care for the next person in line. The real what-if questions: what if we had the means to measure new things that were considered unmeasurable and use them? What if these unmeasurables provided the opportunity to figure out how to intervene more effectively? What if we all demanded these, all new medical technology had the ability to talk to computers and each other openly, so we could do even more of this, all right? Something that companies hate. What if we had all these choices, but chose not to? We do experience resistance. The system's used in Dunedin now. Their control in blood glucose is almost identical to that in Christchurch, but they're convinced it doesn't work, even though it's better than what they had before by the numbers. Not invented here is a real problem. And it's a real problem that's often not overcome by facts, figures, or proof, because like every patient is different, so must be every unit, it seems. So that's the question. What if every unit was actually more or less the same? What if we had the opportunity to redesign our ICUs and new hospitals take best advantage of new technology and growing demand, include things like Wi-Fi? What if we had that choice but chose not to? All right, a full ICU, from a business perspective, an ICU is used to maximum capacity. Therefore, by definition, is not wasting money. But it's a real bummer if you're like next on the list. What if those patients left out had a choice? So, which is to say, in conclusion, I lied just a little bit. You came to see a talk about intensive care medicine and technology, and I mostly talked about economics and hospital units and how stuff works in and around it, and not much about the technology. You learned that patients are really variable, and then you learned how you can measure things that are somehow unmeasurable. And we do that with a wide range of what I call mathemagic. All right, which is to say, what if we use ubiquitous, well-accepted technology to better understand a medical problem, or several of them, right, and thus make the solution preferably easy or easier. The salient sign that what we do is right, particularly in all the reference sites here in Hungary, Belgium, where we've used it. Right? The nurses haven't thrown it out the window yet. Right? Nurses come in one commonality between all of them. They're all highly opinionated. All right? They in fact appear to like these solutions. That's the second commonality. They're not always good at showing they really like things. We have to assume it. All right? It's all about better tools to do a better job for patients, less time, stress, effort, uncertainty, or worry. Right? In a world where demand outstrips supply, right? That's probably the most important goal, all right? And I'm back to the beginning of my talk. So it's just Godzilla versus Bambi. This is an old film. It sounds like an aside. It was a bit of a satire because the film itself was about 1 second long, thump, right? With about 52 minutes of credits. So I want to point out I did all this work entirely by myself with no help from anybody because I am a staggering, towering, exquisite professor genius who works in many countries with a large consortia of people. And I'd like to thank, last but not least, the nursing staff. That's it.